the first thing you're going to be seeing is the last evidence presentation, and it's going to be an update of the Scottish Climate Change Plan. Back in 2018, the Scottish Government published its Climate Change Plan, and just now it's published the Climate Change Plan update. So it's an update to that original plan. But it's important to note that this plan sets out a range of policies and emission reductions, but these policies haven't yet been calculated for how much sort of emission reduction is possible. And so we don't know yet whether they're sufficient to meet the 2030 or the 2045 targets. So that's important to note. There's plans for cutting emissions. It's been published since we started the beginning of the process. So we thought that it would be useful to see it because it's something that's happened whilst we've been deliberating. And it will help the Assembly focus on the recommendations that are in areas that we feel that the plan doesn't address sufficiently. So we're going to hear a presentation from Fabrice Levesque from the Climate Emergency Response Group on this climate change update plan. So just for information, the Climate Emergency Response Group is a collection of like-minded leaders spanning Scotland's private, public and third sectors, delivery organisation and membership bodies. The group aims to inform and influence the Scottish Government's response to the climate emergency by providing practical, workable solutions that can be implemented, not in the future, but now. That's the important thing. So, Kayla, when you're ready, please play the presentation. Thank you. Right, that's great. Thanks very much. This morning session, we have our evidence use. We've got Dave Reay, Professor Dave Reay from the University of Edinburgh, also a member of the CERG group, the Emergency Response Group that you just heard from. And he's going to be here to our gene group. You can have other exhibitions, but we're going to do a Q&A.
Okay, so as yesterday, we're going to have this sort of Q&A session. Yeah, you may have spotted on the slide, I had the wrong name for the person that's here. We actually do have Dave. So he's here. And again, focusing very much, you will remember Dave, I think, from, he spoke at the second weekend of the Assembly as well. So because this is the sort of diet and lifestyle and land use stream, we're expecting that most of the questions will probably, relate to that side, because it's about helping us try and think, well, how do we make sure we take this information and help build it into the recommendations we're doing. So like yesterday, I've opened up the chat for people. So we can definitely, if people have any questions, we can start collecting them in the chat. And if you have any problems with the chat, just give me a wave or use the sort of put your hand up button, and we might be able to take questions that way. So Dave, I don't know if you wanted, just while people are sort of thinking through any of the questions there, if you have any sort of initial comments that you would like to add to the presentation we've seen?
Yeah, I mean, Fabrice summed it up pretty well in terms of this update to the climate change plan. Like Pete was saying, the original one was 2018 and they updated it because they had increased the target to net zero by 2045, the Scottish Government. So there's a lot of good stuff in the update in terms of they tried to take this, what they call coordinated approach. So they looked at things like land use and they said, look, we can't just look at that from just agriculture and food or just trees or just peatlands. We need to integrate that. So that was good in terms of the narrative. I think what was lacking in it, like Pete says, is that there are lots of good proposals and some policies in there, but they didn't have time because of COVID to actually look at what their proposals and policies would actually translate to in terms of emission reduction. So it's a bit of an optimistic update in terms of saying hopefully all these things will deliver on the 2030 target, which you've heard about, and the 2045 net zero target. So they had to be a little bit, I suppose, careful about their wording around, what would be delivered and when. The other thing that's in there that Fabrice mentioned is there's quite a big reliance on these negative emission technologies. So essentially sucking carbon out of the atmosphere and putting it back in the ground. And those technologies, they exist, but they're not really proven at scale, certainly at the scale that we would need them in Scotland. And they're supposed to come online in this climate change plan update by the end of this decade. So by 2029, we would have carbon being sucked out of the atmosphere. And that's a bit of that's quite optimistic to see that kind of magnitude of carbon capture and storage happening by then. So one of the things that quite a few of us, when we've been responding to the climate change plan update, have been asking, well, what happens if you haven't got that? What's the backup plan? If you can't do it through sucking carbon out of the atmosphere, where are you going to find the cuts elsewhere? And that's something that is tricky, but you kind of, I certainly would like the Scottish Government, once they run all their models and said, right, this is what our plans and proposals will deliver, does that go far enough? And is what happens if we haven't got this carbon capture and storage technology online?
Okay, so Dave, we've got a few questions now appearing for you. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to ask you, so we can get through as many as we can, try and answer them as sort of concisely but effectively as possible. This will be your challenge.
I'll try my best. I'll start from the top, Kayla. So from Lewis.
Well, yeah, I'll pick some out too, but we've got that one from Lewis. So because not everyone's seen, how can the government make Scotland's landowners want to engage with sustainable practices in order to meet the emission targets rather than just forcing them by law?
Yeah, so the main incentive for a lot of landowners, they would say they're already really interested in sustainable practices, and one of the things that's held them back is how they are financially supported. So a lot of landowners in Scotland, certainly most farmers, rely on direct payments. So this is through the Common Agricultural Policy that we were part of until we left the EU. And that constrained a lot of landowners and farmers into using their land in a certain way, often in a way which they didn't agree with, but that was how you got your direct payment. So the main mechanism government has got, and this is a devolved policy, so this is something that the Scottish Government really can help landowners with, is changing that support regime. And so that's the direction of travel in the climate change plan update, is to say, actually, we're going to, so the Scottish Government, reward landowners for more sustainable practices. And that would include not just reducing emissions through farming and planting more trees and restoring peatlands, but also increasing the nature values, so the biodiversity of those environments. So money is probably the most important one. Regulation is part of that. But I think for most landowners and farmers in Scotland, actually, it's less about regulation. It's more about them having the capacity to know what to do, but also that financial support system being right so they can actually do the stuff they want to do.
Okay, and just to say to people, I know there's a lot of questions in there around some of the home stuff and the home heating. Really, a lot of that's being picked up in the other streams. So I really want to pick up some of the ones that really relate to the sort of diet and lifestyle and land use stream, because that's where we actually can get the best out of Dave as well. So we've got a question from Ellie about what's the main thing you would suggest to help shift the culture of Scottish diet trends to a more sustainable plant-based diet? The main thing.
Yeah, that's a great question, Ellie. And I think the main thing we need at the moment is, and Fabrice mentioned this, is the dietary advice that is provided. So we have an Eat Well guide in Scotland, which is focused on public health, is on the health of all of us. And we know we should eat more fruit and veg, those kind of things. Actually, what that needs to do is, I think, encompass the environmental benefits of that as well more clearly, because there are huge environmental benefits from eating better. So that's one of the things which has been committed to by the Scottish Government, but nothing's really happened. And I think they're very sensitive about it because, quite rightly, they don't want to tell us what to eat, and we won't not happy about being told what to eat, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't be better advised on what to eat and have the benefits pointed out. And I guess in terms of public procurement, so things like food in our schools and hospitals, actually there's a real role there for making sure that our kids, that, you know, us when we're in hospital, we're getting good food, which is good for us in terms of our health, but also fits with where we want to go with Scotland in terms of getting to net zero, enhancing biodiversity. So I think the key thing is that dietary advice, and that's something which can't just sit in public health, it can't just sit in environment in the Scottish Government. It needs to be, as ever, joined up. It needs to take that coordinated approach on diet and to give us that good holistic advice on what we should be eating.
Okay, we've got a question here from Kirsten around agriculture. That agriculture was mentioned as one of the industries in the plan that was weak in terms of, you know, the plan was weak on, sorry, in terms of reducing emissions. What specifically needs further action or attention there in your view?
Yeah, it kind of, it's really, when you're a carbon geek like me and you look at the what the plan said should happen in the different sectors, agriculture kind of stood out because the reduction was smaller than most of the other sectors by 2032, which is the time frame of this climate change plan update. But then when I looked at it in more depth and talked to a few folk about where the numbers had come from, it's much more ambitious than it was in 2018. And one of the things that's kind of not properly represented in the numbers is that the reliance for agriculture is also to produce bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. This is producing crops or woody material for producing energy, for producing heat and electricity. And that's not captured in that commitment for agriculture. So it kind of misrepresents a bit what the different sectors do. So agriculture is expected to do more than it might appear from that number. But I guess the key question from Kirsten is what specifically needs further action and attention. And that is that support regime. It is the money, what is paid to landowners, to farmers, to make these changes, to sequester more carbon, to reduce emissions from livestock or crop production. And one of the major things with that is making sure that it is doable for the farmers and landowners. So one of the things that we see is a bit of a capacity gap in some areas. So if we're expecting farmers to change what they're doing, to plant more trees, then they need the training and skills for that. They need the advice for that. So the advisory service needs to be bolstered and needs to have the expertise to help farmers. But we also need a regional approach. We all know how diverse Scotland is, how our landscape is very diverse. So if we just say, right, there needs to be more trees, and if you're in an area like my farm that you can see behind me on the picture, you could just say, well, that's rubbish land for producing food compared to the east of Scotland. So you should just grow trees. And using that blunt approach just won't work. It won't work in terms of acceptability for landowners and farmers. It will damage communities and it would be basically an unsustainable way forward. What we need is a support regime, this is my personal view, which takes account of the fact that all land has many demands on it. There's certainly potential for more trees. There's more potential for more peatland restoration. We have to have that. But that needs to be in the context of still producing food, so we don't have to import more food. So it's looking at landscapes like ours in the west of Scotland and having that conversation with farmers about what will work well in those soils and those climates where we can still produce some food, but we can also increase, like I say, the nature value and carbon sequestration. So it's looking at that whole farm basis rather than that whole of Scotland basis and saying what works well for that farm in that region, making sure that the stakeholders, in this case, the landowners and farmers, are really involved rather than it being just a top-down, someone with a big map of Scotland saying, right, all of this area is going to be trees and all of this is going to be food production.
I think this next question from Carol kind of relates a bit and builds on what you were talking about there. But this idea of couldn't government encourage people to do the right things rather than telling them what to do by producing things like the information leaflets and some of that campaign work that was highlighted, much like they've done for the COVID vaccinations. And I'm going to link it to something that Forbes has put in there as well around, government seem to be great at setting these goals, but seems they might sort of miss the targets due to the wishy-washy nature of the commitments. And is there any indication they actually will change. Yeah, there is an appetite for change.
Yeah, so I could completely agree on what we need is good advice, good information, the kind of stuff all of you have been doing for months now in terms of being well informed, and that helps us, particularly when we're making choices around our lifestyles and diets. They're personal and they're private things, and actually, you know, there is no I don't think there's a sustainable role for government telling us what to do in terms of what to eat. It's more about giving us good advice so we can make informed choices. Part of that is also, I think, about price and about accessibility. So it's great to say we should be eating 10 fruit and veg a day, but if that is, you know, outside of our budget, then that's not possible. So that's more the role of government, is to give good advice, but also look at how our food production is supported and look at that pricing, so that we don't end up with just the, you know, the middle classes being able to eat well for the planet and for themselves, and everyone else not having access to what is a good diet. So it needs to be linked up with the reality in terms of price as well.
I've got just one, I think we've got time for one. Oh, sorry, was there more, Dave?
I thought there was a second part to your question.
The second part was about the sort of appetite for moving beyond the kind of wishy-washy commitments that Forbes highlighted.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. There are, I suppose you could call some of the ideas wishy-washy. I suppose there's more in the climate change plan update, which is we are going to have a discussion, we are going to set up a working panel, that kind of thing, which you could call wishy-washy, because this is urgent. We really need to make progress on not just the land use and agriculture sector, but all the sectors. There's a lot of good stuff in there. I suppose the main issue comes back to they don't know what it will deliver in terms of emission reductions. So I think there's a real appetite to get those numbers, and I know the Scottish government are working hard on that now to get the numbers. And I think if they don't add up, if the computer says no, this won't get us there, then we really need to have a plan of, right, what else needs to happen? Can we go further? Where can we go further to make sure we're on target for the climate goals we've set in Scotland?
And I've got one last question. I think we've got one last question we've got time for while we're still in the big group here. And it's coming from Shona about, do you support increasing the price of environmentally unfriendly foods as a way of changing diets? Or do you think education programs based on that kind of eat well model would be working well enough without that stick?
Yeah, so this comes back to, I guess, more of the role of government is to look at that. And obviously we have things like the sugar tax, we've got things like minimum alcohol pricing. So there are already examples where, from a health perspective, government are already intervening. I think that is something where the better way is to actually look at how you can make more competitive price-wise the things which would go into a sustainable diet. So I think if we've got good sustainable dietary advice, that's great, but that needs to be developed in context with what is the real cost of this. If someone sees this and they go, right, this is my budget, can I feed my family based on this advice? And if the answer is no, then that's where government needs to go. Actually, we need to intervene here in terms of the pricing model, what we're supporting in terms of production, to make sure that a good diet is actually an affordable one as well.
Okay, I'm going to have to draw this to a close there, but I think we're going to put you into the breakout groups, and I think Dave and Pete are still going to be around just for a little while. So if there are sort of some specific additional things you want to grab them, we can send them into your breakout rooms. But I'm just going to hand you over now to your facilitators for a little bit of opportunity to kind of reflect on what you've heard and think, what does this mean for the types of recommendations that we're thinking about at the moment? So open breakout rooms. I'll see you in 20 minutes.